Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Critical Skills for the CFO's New Role. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, then I'll turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, we'd like to thank Oracle NetSuite for their partnership with today's event. They've been wonderful partners to Argyle, and they're committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. Thank you again to Oracle NetSuite. We appreciate you joining us today. We also welcome you to stay socially connected during today's event. For those of you who are active on social media, please use the hashtag ArgyleDigital and follow us at Argyle Exec Forum. Also be sure to follow Argyle on LinkedIn for special announcements. I also wanted to take a minute to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we've curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. We've worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our members' support of this policy. For those of you who are seeking CPE credit today, you must answer at least 3 polling questions and remain on the session for its duration. Polls will be on the right-hand side of the screen, and you'll see them launch when the speaker cues them to launch. After the event, if you're eligible to receive credit, you'll receive an email with a link to your certificate. If you have any questions about credits, please email cpe@argyleforum.com. Finally, and most importantly, we want to hear from you, so please submit all questions that come up during today's event into the chat section of the interface. Following the presentation, we've set aside time for our speaker to weigh in on your questions. Now, without further ado, let's have our speaker introduce himself, and then we'll begin our presentation. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Eric. And I think esteemed speaker, that's the nicest thing anybody said to me kind of all month, so I appreciate that. My name is Tom Kelly. I'm with Oracle NetSuite. I've been with the organization for about 8 years now. My main role there is to focus on our global cloud financials, but I also have responsibility for a couple of our verticals. So the high-tech software vertical, general business, non-for-profit verticals. And I also do work in what we call our EPM offerings, so budgeting and planning, account reconciliation, et cetera. Prior to that, I had my own company for 10 years, primarily putting companies into the cloud. And then prior to that, I was CFO, CIO for various sizes of companies, from $1 billion of revenue to a startup. And that is me. So let's move along here. And so I think, as Eric said, the title for today's talk is going to be Critical Skills for the CFO's New Role. And I feel like I'm somewhat qualified to talk about this because, given my past experience and also a lot of the customers we have, I deal quite regularly with either current customers or potential customers, determining what requirements are, what the fit is, and what functionality they want to get out of our product. So first, the safe harbor statement. Basically, I just say this, and this has been approved by Oracle Legal, and that is, regardless of what I say today, do not make any decisions to buy or sell Oracle stock. And so, not to be redundant, but this is a little bit more detail about me. Some of the companies I have worked for, you may have heard of, Deluxe Corporation, PepsiCo, and I literally cut my teeth in public accounting with back in the day at KPMG in New York City. And so today, I think this is an interesting thing. Accountants today not only have to count the beans, and I can remember, with my colleagues, I would tell them I don't like being called a bean counter. So here's some quick advice for you. If you don't want to be called a bean counter, don't tell people you don't want to be called a bean counter, because once I would do that, I would be called a bean counter all the time. And, a little tongue in cheek there. And I don't know if the moniker is appropriate, but it is simply this, at least in my experience, what I've found out with this is it's somewhat of a thankless job, meaning it's a full-time job, 8 hours or more a day of making sure you're compliant and things are accurate and being, respectful of all the regulations you have to adhere to. But the simple fact is this: nobody really cares about it unless something goes wrong. So if you're doing a great job, you're probably not going to get a lot of, positive feedback or whatever. But if something should fall through the cracks, they're going to be standing at your doorstep. And, one thing I like to tell people, in many organizations had responsibility for payroll. And I distinctly remember this one company, about 200 employees. We had just processed the payroll, and I came in on a Thursday. I came in on the next day, and there were 199 people waiting outside my door to congratulate me because I got their paycheck right. No, there was the one person who unfortunately got shorted 1 hour and was not very happy. So There's a real world example of what I'm talking about. You can extrapolate that to, gosh, just about anything, whether it's reports you're given internally or data you're providing externally, whether it's to the government, SEC, or whatever. It's pretty daunting. So suffice to say, we've got this one full-time job, and that is counting the beans, for lack of a better term. But what about this? I think these days, especially these days, what your colleagues really expect from you is they need you to help grow these beans. And when I say help grow these beans, I mean more than providing insights to the question of, why is revenue up? Your answer can't be because we sold more. That doesn't cut it. So you have to be able to, be this wizard, if you will, have perspective on what's happening with the business, understanding what's driving certain results, so you can educate the organization on what to focus on and do more of, and what to take the focus on and do less of. But in order to do this type of thing, you really have to have, in my estimation, the facts, the information, so that people can, honestly internalize it, so that it is actionable for them, so that they know what to do, and maybe in some regards, believe it or not, know how to do it. So there's a lot that I'm saying there, and we'll get into it as we go through this presentation. But the point I'm making here is, when I talked about counting the beans, that's a full-time job. Talk about growing the beans, that's a full-time job. So really what I'm telling you is, if you're a CFO, finance and accounting professional, in some regards, you've got 2 full-time jobs these days. So how are we going to go from taking 2 full-time jobs and make it manageable, make it, maybe we're accountants and finance people, so I don't want to say an 8-hour a day job, but at least, a 10-hour a day job, because obviously we work hard and we want the rest of the organization to know that. But that's the dilemma. That's the equation that needs to be solved these days, and it's by no means an easy thing to do. And so one of the things that appealed to me, I don't know if you're familiar with Da Vinci's drawing of what's called the Vitruvian Man, but if you combine counting and growing the beans, conceptually what I'm trying to drive at here is the Vitruvian CFO. And what speaks to me about this drawing is it's a little bit of art, a little bit of science. It's also a mathematical equation. But ultimately, if you read about it, it talks to how everything is connected to everything else. So when you look at some of these words here that are across the picture, things like healthcare benefits, in many regards, finance has responsibility for HR these days. So it's not just accounting. Performance reporting, and it's kind of like I was saying before, how do you help grow the organization? How do you make people, focus on the right things? And more importantly, make sure that those things are actionable and they know what to do. What's also happening these days is CIO activities. And I don't mean CTO, where it's more of the, person who's building a product that's technical. This is the CIO type stuff, where it has to do everything from email to ransomware protection and everything in between. Things like board prep, business insurance, negotiating with third parties to get the best possible deal you can get for your organization that, hopefully doesn't, bankrupt the organization, but takes care of the most important asset, that being the employees. And obviously a whole host of other things you can read here. But the point to be made here is there's a lot, and there's a lot that needs to be done. The good point is, I think there's some things that we can talk about here today that make it a little bit more efficient, that make the 2 full-time jobs equation more reasonably solved, for you can boil it down to 1 full-time job. And we'll talk about some examples and some things that industry is saying or predicting for this role as we go into the future. So with that, let's get to polling question number 1. And I think this is a pretty simple question here, but let's just go with, do you think companies are asking too much from their CFOs today? A for yes and B for no. And I've got the Vitruvian Man up there, so I don't want to skew your responses in any way, shape, or form. But it's interesting. I've given this talk a few times, and it's surprising sometimes the responses that we get as we go through not just this polling question, but the other ones that we'll have. So let's talk about the results here. I think we're all sympathetic to what I'm saying. It's kind of a 60-40 split. 63% answered that yes, companies are asking too much of their CFOs today. 38% said no. So, I mean, the point to be made here is, I think, perhaps many of you out there are feeling this, I don't know if pain is what you want to call it, but the challenge that you have in front of you, if you're truly going to be effective in this role. So thank you for answering that poll question. And so a little bit of a joke for you, and I've heard this joke and used it throughout my career, and it's pretty applicable to what I'm talking about. And it goes like this. There's a man, he's at it's fair, and he's in this hot air balloon, and this brisk wind picks up and it blows him way off course, way out into the countryside. He has no idea where he is, how he's gotten there. And he's about over this cornfield, and he's looking down, there's a road, and he sees this man walking down the road. So he lowers the balloon to about 30 feet above the cornfield, and he calls out to the man and says, "Excuse me, sir, can you help me? Can you tell me where I am?" And the man on the ground looks down at the cornfield, looks up at the balloon, and he goes, "Why, yes, you're in a balloon about 30 feet above this cornfield." The balloonist just shakes his head and goes, "You, sir, must be an accountant." And the man on the ground says, "Why, yes, I am. How do you know that?" The balloonist responds, he says, "Well, what you've told me is technically correct, but it's of no use to anyone." Now, hopefully you're chuckling there, but I was born and raised in New York, so I do have a little of a cynical bent. So I added this. The man on the ground calls up to the balloonist and says, "Excuse me, sir, but you must be a manager." And the balloonist says, "Why, yes, I am. How do you know that?" And the accountant responds, "Well, you don't know where you are. You don't know how you've gotten here. You're in the same place you were before we met, yet now somehow it's my fault." So I use this joke not just because I think it's a funny, I'm an accountant, so don't judge me too much, but I think there's a lot of reality in this joke, in that I think accountants in some regards are given a pretty bad rap. Now, that's not to say there aren't some accountants out there who, give you the answer, you're 30 feet above a cornfield, or hence revenue's up. Why is that? Because we sold more. What I think organizations, or perhaps the balloonist, is looking for is a little bit more tangible information, a little bit more actionable information, so that they can, do something with it and improve the situation that they're currently in. So I share that joke, both hopefully to, get a little bit of a chuckle, but I think there's a lot of reality in it. And so here I am talking about how, when accountants and finance individuals have 2 full-time jobs, and talking a little bit about what they need to do. Well, if you're not going to believe me, the CPA exam is changing, and it's adding 2 sections to it. One's already been added, and I think one's coming in, January of next year. One is data analytics. So having the ability to look at information, draw inferences, conclusions, and provide, solutions to whatever the question that's being asked, but leveraging data analytics to the extent possible so that you can do that. The other thing that's being added is technology, being able to evaluate technology, the technology environment, what offerings are available, so that when you are, at your company in charge of whatever it might be, what's the right technology to choose to help the organization become more efficient, to become better, improve results, grow the beans, and also, to make sure that you're choosing the right one, so that you don't make an erroneous decision choosing a bad type of technology that isn't going to help you. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Surprise, surprise, an Oracle NetSuite employee wanted to talk to you about technology. But, in all fairness, I can tell you back in my career, back about 20 years ago, this is what I saw as the real thing to enable me to be very effective at what I'm going to do, and to help, not only my colleagues that were to the left and right of me, but the company on a holistic level, is really being able to, as an accountant, I understand the language of business. So one of the comments I make is, who better than the accountant who understands the language of business to be able to translate for the organization what's happening and why it's happening. But also at the same sense, be able to put in the right type of tools that are going to help me carry this off, right? So not just have a great methodology or a great idea, but bring that methodology and idea to life, mechanizing whatever it is you might need across the organization, from front to back office and everything in between. So a little bit of data for you, if you will. And this is information from the volatility report of 2023 from Chris Kohler Associates. If you don't get it, I highly recommend it. It's some great information about kind of our profession and kind of what's going on with it. And this graph is depicting hiring trends since the beginning of the pandemic, or actually going before that. But what it's showing is external hiring of CEOs is continuing to decline, while the external hiring of CFOs is continuing to rise. You can see it kind of declined a little bit there, I think, subsequent to the pandemic. But what this is saying is that, organizations are really looking within to promote individuals into the role of CEO. What's also very interesting about this is companies are really starting to look more externally to fill the CFO positions, right? Because maybe they want to bring in some new blood. Some people that have the experiences of what I'm talking about have been able to count the beans, grow the beans, and have good examples of experience in that regard. But what they're doing then with those people is they're looking to promote those individuals to the role of CEO, and we'll talk about there a little bit more. So when we look at CFO to CEO, promotions are really trending upwards from the role. And so this is a pretty interesting thing that when organizations look at the pathway, it's very interesting to see that what's happening with the trend line is that organizations are starting to look at the role of CFO as really the one who could fill the CEO's shoes. Now, one of the things I don't have in here is the promotion from CFO to COO. And that trend is even a little bit more steeper in terms of what's happening there. So what I'm really trying to get at here is this is real. I mean, what's happening out there are people that are doing this. There are people that have been successful and effective at doing it. And the organization is recognizing that. And when they look for talent, they're looking at the role, quite frankly, to fill the shoes of, an open CEO position versus going outside the four walls of the organization. So something to consider as we move forward here. Another thing I just want to point out is when we look at the undergraduate degrees in business for CFOs, it's overwhelmingly a major in accounting. And there's a reason why I'm bringing this up, and I'll get into some of these details here in a minute. But that's pretty interesting. So, what you have here is a situation where there's plenty of majors you can choose from a business standpoint, marketing, general business, you name it, or accounting. And while accounting might require a little bit more rigor, perhaps might be a little bit more of a challenging degree, maybe not being all as exciting, let's say, perhaps as the marketing degree. But nonetheless, as I go back to what I said before, really internally understanding the language of business, I think you really need that if you're going to be effective in, not only understanding how an organization works, but more importantly, how that information manifests itself in a financial statement, which is really the vehicle by which I think all negotiations happen, whether you're trying to get a bank loan, you're trying to acquire a company, you're trying to go public, or a whole host of other things. And so here's the dilemma, the reason why I wanted to bring up the point about the accounting degree. And this is the pending dilemma I think that's happening. So job security in these days is really not enough to keep many of the accountants from quitting. And if you have read stuff lately, there is kind of this mass exodus going on, believe it or not. And so auditors, tax accountants, they're moving on, or they're considering quitting the profession altogether. And what they do, what is happening is when they do kind of the post-interview, what they're citing is that there's other available options at the time of an already widening shortage. So really what I'm talking about there is, that to me speaks that there's some opportunity. But what it also speaks to is not unlike what you saw in the graphs before. Organizations are looking at CFOs to promote into the position of CEO and COO. And quite frankly, why is that? So in some regards, we can say there's this dilemma and people are leaving the profession, but sometimes they're leaving the profession to that job that perhaps is a little bit outside of the realm, if you will, of just closing the books and other things that you may do in the accounting and finance role. So it's an interesting dynamic that's happening these days, but it's real. So there's a lot of things happening, from fewer people taking the approach of an accounting degree, where you saw before that was the most sought after degree for undergraduate business degrees, to even people leaving the profession and less people sitting for the CPA exam. So there's a challenge going on right now. And so if we want to look at this graphically, this shows the U.S. accountants with greater than 6 years, or greater than equal to 6 years of experience, who quit. And what's interesting here is you can see there's quite a tick upward from 2019 on. And what's interesting is when you look, you go more detail in terms of the numbers, there was about 1.65 million accountants in the U.S. in 2022. Now, this was up about 1.3% from the previous year, but down 2.6% from 2020, but down 15.9% from 2019. So you can see this is having a pretty dramatic effect. It's also noted that 300,000 accountants quit their jobs between 2019 and 2021. So fewer people, as I said, are starting to pursue the accounting degrees, and they're entering fields, leading to more open positions for longer periods. And the quote, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can read. This is from the Wall Street Journal, but one of the quotes that struck me is, "I definitely do not want to do repetitive work." Right. So I think one of the biggest things that organizations really need to overcome is, like I said before, you have to be able to count the beans, and to some degree that can be competitive work. But what is happening out there right now in industry that's going to reduce the amount of competitive work or repetitive work, and give people the opportunity to maybe be more on the Hollywood side, growing the beans, being able to interpret information. And, frankly, as I said before, 2 full-time jobs goes at all different levels. So maybe now you have to be in a situation where we're not searching and compiling information for, days on end, and we have capabilities and technology that's bringing it to the forefront, but it can't all be machine-based. There has to be some human involvement. And that's the piece that, I think there is some shift going on right now in the industry. And by no means I want to imply that it's perfect or people have cracked the nut, but I think we're going in the right direction. And here's this one final thing about this. This was a 2022 survey that Fortune and Deloitte did. And what's interesting is, what position has moved into second place for the question of, what's the most important position for a CEO in terms of their, executive committee. And what that is it's the CFO. So you kind of, I don't want to say everything's aligning, but there are things that are aligning that are allowing organizations to have the perspective as how important it is for people with finance and accounting skills are to the organization. And even more so, it's really manifesting itself in terms of the person that has to run the organization, and who he or she relies on the most these days is the CFO. And so making some of these comments, who am I to make these comments? But let's look at what some of the, more known, more reputable recruitment firms are saying about this. So let's talk about corroboration, an accounting word, your accounting word for the day. So let's look at each one of these individually. So Heidrichs and Struggles, one of the things that they say, about 90% of their clients are placing a strong understanding of operations on the position. So it's at the top of the list. So when they're looking for a CFO to come, and fill the shoes of an open position, what their clients are telling them is they really want to have somebody who, let's say at the very highest level, understands business, and perhaps at the next level down, really understands their business or their industry. And so there's one thing there. It's easy to say that I want to have somebody who's got financial and accounting experience and really understand how business operates. That's great to say. Now the next question is, well, Tom, you just said I have 2 full-time jobs. I've got 1 full-time job. Where am I going to find the time to really understand how business operates? Well, let's talk about that a little bit here. So Russell Reynolds, one of the things that they say is it's leadership. And what they're talking about is winning the hearts and minds of others. And let me be clear about this, what they're saying. When they talk about winning the hearts and minds, they're talking about being an effective leader, let's say, for lack of a better term. And winning the hearts and minds goes to everything from the colleague who's sitting to your left and trying to convince him or her about the information that's there, that it's accurate, it's right, and how they should act upon it. It's also about, it's not just about the Hollywood things of acquiring a business or doing an IPO. It could also be very simply as negotiating an agreement with the bank, or as I showed before, benefits in healthcare, trying to secure what the right types of offerings are going to be for your internal employer, for your employees, while at the same time trying to maintain that balancing act of, cost, if you will, and making sure you're still taking care of the employees. And, you can take this to everything, in terms of how you interact with others. So I think some of the, perhaps the bean counter comment, the other one is, green eye shade, accountants have no personality. So, enough about myself, but, being able to really, interact with others on various levels, showing the acumen in terms of understanding information and what's happening with the business, and also being able to interact with people on a personal and a social level. I mean, you have to be able to do these things if you're going to be effective. And that really all culminates itself in terms of leadership. right? So again, leadership, but not just leadership externally, it's internally and externally and all around. The next is Chris Calder. And what they're saying is, this gets to when I was talking before about how do you get to have this operational experience? And what they're saying is, you make a talent investment and approach it in 5-year segments. And, that's great if you have the time to do this, and the whole goal for them is, gaining this perspective on operational excellence. So having the time to do it, letting your superiors know, hey, I'm in accounting now, but I'd like to work in manufacturing, or I'd like to shadow marketing, whatever it might be. Well, I'd also tell you there's things you can do yourself. And I'll tell you personal experiences I've had is when I go into an organization, whether it's within the same company, a different division, or it's a brand new company. People are human. I think that's a true statement. And what do we like the best to do is we like to tell people about ourselves, who we are, what we do, what makes up what who we are. And when you go to individuals, let's say you're going to the person in charge of manufacturing, and you say to her, hey, I really don't understand manufacturing works, but can I get some experience on the manufacturing line or on the shop floor? I'll tell you, I've never had anybody tell me no, we're not going to. They're like, great, yeah, let's go in on Monday. We'll set it up. You're going to produce something or be part of the production team. And while it may not be a 5-year experience, maybe it's a week or two, and you can really start to understand what's happening with business, how it may operate, aspects of the business. In my days, I worked at PepsiCo for many years. Every time I went to a new location, and Pepsi had a way of doing that a lot, the first thing I would always do, I would go out on what was called a route truck ride. These are the Pepsi trucks that you see that deliver the product to the various locations and locales. Not so much the supermarkets, but the convenience stores, the smaller retail outlets. But it was great because you would get a perspective not only on the individual and how that works, but even the marketplace, how things were working, how they were received by the proprietor of the retail outlet. So it was very interesting to do these. And I took that, and like I said, the manufacturing piece, same thing I do. I talk to somebody about manufacturing. And so the one thing I would say, if you're working in a larger company that has, a lot of locations and you're moving around and seeing these things, you can try something different. So go on a route truck ride, I think that was great, but manufacturing at one location, perhaps distribution at the next, merchandising when they're in the large supermarkets. And you have this understanding where maybe you're seeing kind of the end game of the information, but now you're actually able to put that puzzle together. You can start to see how certain things are fitting together. And it really makes you much more effective in the role that you do. So I'm not arguing that if you have the opportunity to do 5-year segments, by all means, give it a shot. But I would also say, don't just say, oh, I have no time for 5-year segments and give up. There's plenty of things I think you can do. Okay. And then Corn Ferry. Surprise, surprise. And I didn't, these are their words. So I don't want you to think I, merge these things to make it work for what I was saying before, but being able to effectively use customer data and analytics. And let's be clear about something here. You could argue that, well, we do effectively use it, but how do you be effective? Going back to the thing about winning the hearts and minds of others, right? Going back to really understanding operations, all of these things are coming together. But what it really comes down to, I think what anybody really wants is, people want to know you have a plan. People want to know how you're going to do it. People understand, how it's coming together. When you can do that, some of these other things may fall into place, right? Being able to win the hearts and minds of others. Well, if you have certain measurements and people can see that, hopefully they're going to react to them and go in the direction you want. So I don't want to imply that you have to look at each one of these things separate. In many regards, they're meshed. And so the point to be made is you got to start somewhere. So make the effort. I encourage you to do that. And where you have the opportunity to do some of these things, outside of the realm of accounting and finance, do it, because it's going to do nothing than help you. That's really what's going to end up happening. And frankly, it'll help the business and technically the employees at that company. So let's move on to polling question number 2. And so outside of expected accounting / financial skills, what is the most important skill set for today's CFO? Understanding operations, leadership, strategic thinking, or in-depth knowledge of technology? Wow, I've really seeded these questions, but in any event, let's take a stab at this and let's see what the audience says. All right, numbers are still coming in. I think we're getting close. All right, so it's interesting. The top answer is strategic thinking. 40% of you said strategic thinking is, the most important skill set. So let me just, this might have been a little bit of a trick question. How do you think you get there? So you can read, books about strategy. That's true. But how do you become effective at that? Well, there's you can always do certain things, SWOT analysis, whatever it might be. You can find a, approach, a methodology. But I think what really matters is what's the substance behind that methodology. So while I don't disagree with you, strategic thinking might be a little bit more of a catch-all. But if you're really going to be effective at that, I would argue that what comes into as a close second is going to be understanding operations. And surprisingly, that does come in second here. 33% of you said understanding operations. So, and then leadership being the third, and an in-depth knowledge of technology is less. So, just going to tell you from personal experience, 3% of you said that. And so here's the thing I'm going to tell you. We have this stuff going on today. You may have heard of it. It's a concept called AI. I don't know if you've heard of that. Look it up. And I have a lot of people who talk to me when we go to conferences. We just had our Sweet World event, our annual event, and people are really scared, particularly in the accounting and finance functions. My job's going to go away. And I'm not saying it's probably much more of a reality in a sense as to this technology relative to like blockchain of a few years ago. That was another one that was going to get rid of everybody's job. So I'm not saying there are certain things that are going to change, but I think it might be the good things. You saw the quote earlier where the person said, I hate doing repetitive tasks. Well, one of the things AI is shown that's going to have a very, very a big impact on is those things that are repetitive, the transaction level stuff. The mundane, perhaps even tedious, might be a word I'd use here. It can, I'm not going to profess I have all the answers. I don't know if it's going to do away with all of it 100%, but I think it could do away with a considerable amount. But the other thing I'll just tell you, the caution I throw out to anybody is with any new thing, or we had data warehouses, that was going to be the greatest thing. Well, there's still a lot of legwork that has to happen. So if you're going to take AI and say handle the transactions, there's usually two sides to a transaction. So you got to make sure you're able to set up those two sides so that when the information comes through, it's going to be easily matched or whatever has to happen. So don't kid yourselves that this is going to happen overnight and your job's going to go away in a day. I don't think that's the case. But what I also think it is they're going to need people to understand how to manage it, how to leverage it, how to work with it. So again, AI is one thing, but even technology beyond that, ERP systems. I'm not going to go down that road. I think you might know where my recommendation might be, but I might be a little biased in that regard. But the point to be made is there's technology that can help with the heavy lifting, and it's extremely important, I think, that you really understand that, because it's kind of the example I use. If you were going to build a deck on your house or whatever, you may go to Home Depot, Lowe's, whatever the Ace Hardware, whatever it might be, because you're going to have to buy wood, or maybe you want composite, or maybe you want railings of metal. You're going to want paint or stained. You're going to need nails. You need screws. You're going to need machinery. You're going to need measurement capability. You're going to need all these type of things. And there's nuances in terms of what you're aesthetically desiring, and also, quite frankly, what your skill set is, right? So do I outsource that? Which I'll tell you, I did this summer. My experience would probably say, please outsource it, but I digress. But the point to be made is you have to go into that place and you have to kind of have an idea what you're looking for. So if you're going to buy composite, this kind of wood and plastic type thing, and then you're going to go buy paint to paint it, you don't need to do that, but you have to have some perspective. So again, I don't want to overdo this, but I really do highly recommend that the 3% on the technology, I think that needs to be higher if you're going to be effective at what I've been talking about, and that is taking 2 full-time jobs and trying to make it into 1 full-time job. It won't happen if you think you're going to do that with Excel spreadsheets and an accounting system. Been there, and highly recommend you don't go there. And surprise, surprise, as I talk about technology, this was a survey done by IDC. They're a large analyst house, but digital transformation of finance. They're saying that technology and transformations are now essential CFO skills. So what organizations are looking for is, yes, they want you to count the beans and grow the beans, but I think what they're also expecting of you is you really need to understand the world of technology and what's the right thing to do for your organization at all levels: accounting, manufacturing, sales, etc. And so the to-do list, the key activities that a CFO does. So I put some of these things together to just, maybe show this in another way. There are the usual suspects, right? Most monthly close and account reconciliation, accounts payable and accounts receivable, payroll, travel and expense management. But there's other things that are happening now, right? Whether it might be taxes, where maybe you farmed them out, but now you can maybe bring that in-house. Financial planning and analysis. More and more these days, with the pace at which things change in business, you have to be able to be as proactive as possible, not reactive. So being able to have a process in place that's going to allow you to engage the entire organization, right? Because you may know how operations work, but that person on the manufacturing line may have a much better perspective on what the forecast might be from a manufacturing standpoint, and then fostering the relationship between manufacturing and sales, so you don't have a manufacturing forecast that's blowing the doors off production because perhaps you told them it's cost per unit, and then sales has got this demand forecast that's way down here. So you have to make sure that the collaboration is across the board, that people are in sync, and you got to be able to do it quickly. And once again, I use Excel all the time, so don't take this comment the wrong way. But if you're going to use Excel to manage a process, a holistic process that is in a constant state of change, well, I think the outcome is too obvious to require alliteration. There's a little shout out to my friend Paul Harvey, if you've ever heard his Common Man talk. So here's the thing, folks. Go ahead. Ask me if the books are closed one more time. As I said, I've been a CFO at many organizations. Closing the books is something that I'm not quite sure how to position it. Let's just say I can really identify with my friend Samuel L. Jackson here. And probably a lot of you didn't know this. He used to be a CFO before he went into Hollywood. And you may have thought that scene in Pulp Fiction, was a scripted scene. No, it actually would come out of his experience at companies and people constantly asking him if books are closed yet. So here's the point. It is probably, akin to the same situation if you're backing out of your driveway on a way to a destination and the people in the back seat ask, are we there yet? And they do that about 50 times through the, hour and 10-minute drive. The same thing is true about closing the books and kind of the experience you get from the organization, because really what this is saying is they're craving information. And quite frankly, the last thing you want to be is the bottleneck in terms of getting them that information. And so I want to go into this a little bit deeper, talking about the close and talking about why it's important. And so I did an analysis, and I did this about a year ago. So I'm going for directionally correct. So I'm sure, I would hope some of the numbers have increased. But I wanted to find out how many companies there are worldwide. And so the world population at the time was about 7.8 billion. It is estimated that 10% are not working and 18% are students and minors. So to come up with a calculated number of humans working on the face of the planet, that was about 5.6 billion. Now remember, I'm going for directionally correct. The next thing I did is I wanted to find out the average firm size. So I'm sure, as we all know, we Googled it, and we know whatever comes up on Google is right. But I digress there. The truth is, I'm sure that number is a little bit smaller these days because there seems to be a lot more companies. I can speak from personal experience within Oracle NetSuite here that there are a lot more companies out there. But let's just assume, for the sake of this example, we're trying to be directionally correct, that the average firm size is 20. And so if you take the number of calculated individuals working divided by the average firm size, that implies that on the face of the earth, the total companies worldwide are about 281 million. So what does that mean? Why am I bringing that up? Well, here's the number. What that means is if you multiply that by 12, meaning let's assume they're all dutiful and they're closing the books, that means that 3.4 billion times a year, the books are being closed on the face of the earth. Now, why am I bringing it up? Think about that number, 3.4 billion times a year. Now, think about your close. I'm sure there's been some improvement. I mean, it's a lot better than it was in the 90s, a lot better than it was in the 2000s, but I'll argue that it is by no means, I think, kept up with the pace of change in technology in the world in general. So that means 3.4 billion times a year, people are closing the books. So I just want to point out one other thing, the continuous accounting zone. And so, if you will, I love this is the old Twilight Zone. It would go like this: you're entering another dimension, the dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. It's a journey to a wondrous land whose entries are boundless. Your next stop, the continuous accounting zone. So I won't quit my day job, but it really appealed to me when I heard those words, because when we talk about continuous accounting, and I want you to brace, there's a little warning here. When I would do this live, half the audience would faint. But I told them that what we're going to be doing is we're going to be closing the books 24/7, 365. So it's bad enough to say you got to do it once a month. Now you're telling people they have to do it every day of every month of every year, which if you do the mathematics on that, it's over 120 billion times a year. Technically, you're closing the books. So you can see that, oh my gosh, what are we getting into here? But the reality is this: with the advent of technology and what's happening, we've talked about AI a little bit and how it perhaps can mechanize a lot of the repetitive, mundane tasks at the transaction level. The opportunity to really embrace continuous accounting is here. And the more you can do it, I think the better you're going to be, the more effective your organization is going to be at doing certain things that go a little bit beyond closing the books, counting the beans, right? So let's get into this a little bit more about what I'm talking about. And so before we do that, let's get to polling question number 3. So this one is: adoption of continuous accounting methodology is very important to becoming a modern day CFO. Strongly agree, B, agree, C, you somewhat agree, or D, you disagree. So let's see where the answers come in here. I should have been a lawyer, because they always say, don't ask a question unless you know what the answer is going to be. And, I'm sure it's because I'm just such a compelling presenter that you're responding this way. All right. So between strongly agree and agree, it's over 80%. So over 80% of you are indicating that, yep, this is an extremely important thing to be able to do. Now, a lot of people say, oh my gosh, where do I start? But let's talk about this. So just a little bit with the continuous accounting, my advice to you is it's almost simple, not just complex. It's as simple as this: if you were in manufacturing, you've always heard about process improvement. You need to take the same type of orientation to your close. Process improvement. Manage it. Manage the close like a project, an ongoing project, a project that never ends. Hopefully it gets better and better. But when you start doing these things, you'll start seeing you have some real wins. And so I would just encourage you to take the first step, whatever that might be. It could be in terms of reconciling a bank account, it could be deciding on new types of technology, but whatever it is, do that. So let's go now to the other thing where we're talking about you want to be able to help grow these beans. And so people in your organization, being able to, give them information on what they need to do and how to do it. And I'm asked to speak a lot on like, what are the best KPIs for finance? And, on some level, I almost feel like I'm an old, teacher I used to have or something where, what's the answer to this? And then you end up having to go research it yourself. And I would highly encourage you to do that for your situation, because I'm not arguing that, EBITDA or return on assets or cash flow. Yeah, those are all important metrics. But I think the things that really solve problems, really drive the performance of an organization are things that are much more insightful, really understanding how certain things operate within an organization. And I show this thing here about Freakonomics, Get Your Freak On. This is a book, and there's a subsequent call. I think it's called Super Freakonomics, and they have a podcast. There's a whole bunch to it. But it's a great book that really gets into cause and effect. In other words, things that have happened in society and really what caused them and the correlation. And it's very surprising because it's like, well, I would have never thought that was the cause of, this particular situation. But what that does is it puts your organization, I think, into the mindset of, hey, let's look at what's happening within our company. And let's really understand, what's driving certain things and really start to drill down on it, because then I think you actually get what I would say is the aha moment, or the thing that's really going to move the needle for your organization for maybe just one extreme particular pain point, or maybe it's a host of them. But I would encourage you, take into account where you are in terms of your company, the industry you operate in, the resources you have at your disposal, the vendors you interact with, the customers you have. All of these things really need to be looked at and thought about. And don't just say return on assets is the right measurement. You really need to have more meaning, I think. And so I told you I worked at Pepsi for many years, and this is actually a picture of a route truck and a route truck driver. And I did this many, many times. But one of the issues we had at Pepsi, we had this odd thing we called costs controllable and uncontrollable. And I don't know why they did that, but they did. And one of the big things that we had a problem with is the bottling operations in the United States, workers' compensation. So you can imagine these men and women are moving heavy cases. They're coming up with injuries, right? It happens. And long story short, what would happen is corporate would negotiate a deal. Let's say you had 10 bottling operations, and let's say they negotiated $1 million in premium. They'd say million divided by 10, here's $100,000, cover it. Well, that is not what was driving the premium. And when we started talking to the insurance companies and we started to figure out what was really happening, what we came to find is it was a very simple metric. It doesn't sound simple, but it was called days work lost. What did that mean? Is that when one of these individuals get injured and they'd go out on injury, the longer the time frame they were out, right? So the more days from the date of injury that they were out, the more the possibility that we would have a lawsuit for workers' compensation. So what we did is we put a whole program around this. Not only did we start tracking it, the measurement, the KPI, but we also put a program around it. And it wasn't disingenuous. We wanted to make sure we were taking care of the employee. We wanted to get them back to work as soon as possible. Now, what that meant is if the person hurt their back, we didn't want them to come back and start working with a hurt back. But a lot of these people had significant tenure. They had great insights, even going back, how do you look at other measurements? So they would come in and we'd have them do other things, but we would get them back to the office. We would do things like if they were the main breadwinner, taking care of the family, being able to deliver meals. So the point to be made is we put a whole program around it. We mechanized it. We managed it in the tune of 30% reduction in premiums year over year as a result of this program, nationwide. So that's an example of what I would say, do the legwork, intuitively understand what's happening with your business, understand where you want to make improvements, and really dig down and dig deep to truly understand what are some of the drivers of cost or, on the flip side, revenue growth. And I'm an ex-baseball player. I actually coach pitchers. Surprise, surprise these days. And if you haven't heard of all the metrics and everything that's available today, I have here Know Your Stuff. And so to let you know that this can apply to anything in life, right? It's not just what happens at your business. But these numbers you see here, this is only half of the numbers of a 3-inning stint by one pitcher. And so for those of you, if you've ever seen the movie Bull Durham, imagine me sitting down with a pitcher. I used to be a pitcher, so again, don't judge. But I would sit down with a pitcher and I'd talk about, okay, let's talk about your release speed. Let's talk about your vertical release angle, your horizontal release angle. Talk about spin rate, talk about spin axis, talk about the tilt, talk about the release height, release side, extension, vertical break, induced vertical break, horizontal break, plate height, plate side. Confused? Exactly. So what we have to do, it goes back to what I was getting at in terms of the example of Pepsi and workers' comp. How do I take all this information, boil it down to something very actionable for the pitcher? So 3 things. I want you to focus on 3 things. Number 1, we're going to focus on building velocity, and we have a program around that, strength training, whatever. Number 2, we're going to focus on your release point, because if you throw 10 different pitches and your release point is different on every one, when you get to the major leagues, batters are going to know, here comes a curveball, here comes a fastball, here comes a changeup. It's a done deal. That's why you're going to get hit very badly. So the idea behind this is give them a very tangible, minimize it down to the key things that really matter, and then you should see, very good performance over time. And, I would tell you more times than not, we have success with these pitchers. So again, it isn't something that just applies to business. Understanding the cause and effect of things and why they happen and how you transact against them is extremely important. And just quickly, be careful about this one. We have a tour guide here at the Museum of Natural History. He's bringing these 2 gentlemen through, standing in front of a T-Rex skeleton. And he says, this T-Rex skeleton is 68 million and 4 years old. You see the one gentleman's looking at his friends like, wow, how can you be so accurate? To which the tour guide responds, well, when they hired me 4 years ago, I'll be here all week. And I know, don't quit my day job, folks. So I'm going to go through this quickly because we're running out of time here, and I think it's a little bit redundant. But the role of CFO is expanding, chief communicator, but be careful. It's not just inside your 4 walls of your organization. It's across the board, everybody you meet with. Risk officer. Now that you have the responsibility for things like CIO, this is things like making sure you can mitigate ransomware attacks. So the risk officer sense in the past, it goes beyond just market risk and all. It goes real tangible daily risk. Deal maker. Now, let me be clear. You see things here, it's like venture capital, M&A, strategic partnerships. But think about that. I said earlier, negotiating relationships with a bank. It could be any type of a deal and being effective at doing that. I would argue if you can be effective in negotiating a rate with a landlord for a retail outlet, you might be surprised you can take a lot of those skill sets and apply them to a lot of other things. And then, as we talked about, chief strategist, really being able to be effective in that role. So let's get to our last polling question number 4. And this one is, which one of these skills do you feel you need to work on the most to improve? Chief communicator, chief risk officer, chief deal maker, or chief strategist? And let's see what we say. And this one is a little bit even across the board. So we're kind of, the two big winners are chief communicator and chief strategist. And it's interesting you've picked those two as the two top ones. Both are a little bit north of 30%. Because if you're a chief strategist and you can't communicate effectively with anybody, well, I think we know where that's going to end up. So you have to be able to, walk the talk, so to speak. So it's one thing to have great ideas and great methodologies. It's a whole different thing to bring those methodologies and ideas to life. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is to be able to effectively communicate with people at all levels. So kudos to you all. So surprise, surprise, Oracle NetSuite guy is going to tell you one of the things you really need to be effective to do all of this stuff and to do it effectively is basically having the right type of technology. It truly is a secret weapon. And I speak from personal experience, going back 30 years, I remember when NetSuite came out, it was called NetLedger, and I was using it, and the person I was the CEO thought I was out of my mind that I was going to be putting our general ledger in the quote unquote, I don't think they called it the cloud then. I think it was called on demand or something. But anyway, I digress. But the point is, you really have to be able to leverage technology. And like my building the deck example, make sure you kind of know your way around the technology that's available and what's going to be right for your organization. So it's important that you do that. And let's just take this a little step further. GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. Having it embedded in your ERP system, I think, is very profound, because if you're trying to count the beans and making sure you're going to be compliant with a whole host of things, you have to make sure you're very effective at that. Well, I don't think if you're going to try to do that manually, day in and day out, you're going to be able to accomplish anything, because this is going to envelop everything you do. But if you have a system, a great example I would use is, let's say, revenue recognition. And with all the wonderful regulations you have with that, let's also say you operate in the US and you operate internationally. And the revenue recognition rules, ASC 606 and the IFRS rule, internationally, you'd like to think, wow, they're the same. No, they're not. There's some consistencies, but they're different. So imagine having to take, let's say your European entity has 150 different contracts, or US entity has 500 different contracts. Those are the contracts that really dictate how you're going to recognize revenue. So think about back in the day when depreciation, we finally had a depreciation mechanization where I could take the cost of the asset and divide it by 10 years, and I have my depreciation expense by year and month. Imagine trying to be able to do that when you have 50 different relative items in a contract. Well, if you can mechanize that, make it part of your ERP system, the mere fact by now you're using your ERP system, you're going to be de facto compliant with a US ASC 606 regulation or an IFRS international regulation for revenue recognition. So something to think about. And there's a whole host of other things that go into it too. But that's just probably, one example top of mind. And so we do have a great white paper on this if you'd like to read more about it. But what CFOs want in a CFO, if you can, read to your heart's content, I think it's about a 20-page white paper. It's a good read, gives you some insights and all, and I think you'll find a lot of the things that I've talked about here will echo in this document. And so I'll end with this. Heraclitus, for those of you who don't know who Heraclitus was, he is the one who is attributed to, he didn't say this, but his writings is that he's attributed this concept that the only constant is change. So Heraclitus was a brilliant man, I guess you could all say, but I did a little more reading on him, and I don't want to be too vulgar here, but apparently he had some illness, and apparently the cure to that illness was to cover himself in manure and go lie out in the field. and he was trampled to death by the horses. So nonetheless, I think Heraclitus was right that the only constant is change. But then again, it's all about making good choices in life, folks. And I would argue Heraclitus should have thought twice about the rubbing myself with manure and laying out in the field. So sorry to leave you with such a down thing, but nonetheless, be careful who you follow and why you follow them. And so I think you can do this, right? Technology really can turn 2 full-time jobs into one, almost, right? To give acumen to the accountants. As I said, the CPA exam is now requiring you to have acumen in terms of data analytics and technology. Companies are looking within more so than ever to fill the role of COO and CEO, and they're looking at the CFO position more so than ever. Bean counter, green eye shade, remove those words from your vocabulary. And frankly, as I said, accounting is a language of business. You speak it, so who better to interpret what's going on with the organization and to set the direction for an organization than all of you. So with that, we've got about 4 more minutes. I'll open up to any Q&A.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. Just as a reminder, audience members can still enter questions, and now we're going to review some of the questions that have come in so far. The first question is, how about using AI for analysis?
Yeah, I mean, you can use AI for a lot of things that you've seen out there. So just to say, we've just come out with a thing called Intelligent Insights, part of the planning and budgeting thing. And really what it does is it takes into account however much information you have. So if you have 4 months of information or 4 years of information, it's a great tool to, literally press the proverbial button, and it culminates all this information and it brings back to you projections in the data, anomalies in the data, biases in the data. So it really even makes you, more effective at, we've snapped the chalk line for a forecast, but now we're having the machine go through and kind of go through all this stuff, and it comes back and it shows us, we really need to refine this forecast. But more importantly, it has details as to why perhaps there's differences in the forecast and what's happened historically. So absolutely. I mean, I think AI will have applicability there, but I go back to what I said before. It's one thing to say there's a difference, right? It's another thing to say, AI's right, I'm going to take that forecast. And I think, as we all know, we have to have somebody who can, massage the information so AI knows what to do with it, and you can come out with the answer that is actually intuitive, more factual. It's pinned in the sense of, the details. So I would say at this point in the AI trajectory, I wouldn't just take it for its own word, but I would say run it, and then you need to interact with it and make it better. I think that's the winning case right now. But I would strongly, if you have the opportunity to do it, I would definitely leverage it.
Thank you. I want to follow up with another AI question, and that is, what are some of the good AI systems you've seen in the industry in general, or for government contracting specifically?
I have to, I can't say I'm very well versed in all of the AI capabilities out there, and I think there's so many of them that I wouldn't even know what to tell you, whether that's ChatGPT and trying to get it to come up with a contract, or even some of the stuff we're working on Oracle NetSuite. But what I would tell you is this, and I should be a candidate because I'm not really answering the question, but what the heck. Like I said, you really should intuitively understand what's happening with the technology. I don't care whether it's an accounts payable module or it's AI for government contracts. I would encourage you to do the research. I would encourage you to understand how things work so that you know the information you're getting and you can interpret that with a sense of confidence. I think you need to do those things. I don't have specific names here right now. Go look at Tom Kelly AI. I should probably trademark that, right, Eric? But no, don't Google that. There's no such thing out there. So, next question.
Great. Let's take one last question, and that is, can you give an example of a CFO who's successfully taking on some of these new responsibilities?
I don't want to name names, but there's several, like I said, in terms of working with the clients that Oracle NetSuite has. There are many of them out there that have done this, that have mechanized operations, that have effectively implemented technology, and at the same time have been able to, bridge the gap of making sure the control side of the shop is working well and being able to spend more time on growing the business and interacting and strategically setting direction for the business. I would, myself, I've done it, many times, whether it's as a full-time CFO, CIO, or even as a consultant. So, what I tend to see is I see more of this in the small to mid-sized business segment, and partly that may be true because a lot of our clients are in there, but that's not to say that we don't have some very large companies out there, billion-dollar plus, that have individuals that have been able to do this on an effective basis. But as you can imagine, as a company grows, you have a little bit more in terms of the variables of employees and resources that have to manage certain aspects. But what I've seen with some of the larger customers that we have and their CFOs is they've done a very effective job at making sure that the folks, let's say, that are the controller and that she's really responsible for public reporting, she's doing a very good job at making that as efficient and effective as possible, leveraging technology, XBRL language to report to the SEC. Conversely, on the flip side, the FP&A individual, that person is leveraging some of the tools like I talked about with AI, or just being able to put a budgeting and planning process in place that is pretty fluid, that you can run a forecast almost at a moment's notice. So, I think it depends on the size of company, but what I see is in terms of it manifesting itself in the individual, I see more of that happening, or it's happening quicker at the smaller to mid-sized business level. And when I say smaller to mid-sized, I'd say 500 million is really the demarcation line I'm talking about.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you for that insightful session, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our partner, Oracle NetSuite, and enjoy the rest of your day.